Well, joining us now from our Washington studio is Bill McKibben, the co-founder and chairman of the board at 350.org, an international climate campaign that works in 188 countries around the world. He's an author and environmental activist. In 1988, he wrote The End of Nature, the first book for a general audience about global warming. Bill McKibben, thanks for being there.
Well, what a pleasure to be with you.
Let's start with a statement most frequently used by climate change skeptics. The planet has stopped warming since 1998 and started to cool, actually cool, since 2003. True or false?
Completely false.
Well, McKibben here is simply lying. That's all there is to it. Here's a Hadcrit 3 temperature record since 1997. It's either flat or declining. There's been no statistically significant warming since January 1997 on Hadcrit 3. And since 2002, we've been on a cooling trend, and that cooling trend is accelerating, as we'll see in further graphs. Also, I'm showing you here NCDC graph, the RSS MSU graph, Hadcrit 4 graph, all show cooling over the last 10 years. Only UAH MSU shows a slight warming over 10 years out of the main data sets, but shows a rapid cooling over the last 5 years. RSS MSU shows cooling over 10 years and a very dramatic cooling over the last 5 years. Goose shows very slight warming over 10 years. As we know, this temperature data set has been fraudulently adjusted by Hansen and his mates. The 5-year trend shows a cooling. They couldn't hide that. NCDC shows a cooling over 10 years and 5 years. So does Hadcrit 4. They all show, all these 5 data sets show that the cooling is accelerating. Here's all the data sets together, and it clearly shows a cooling trend is developing. As far as ocean heat content goes, because the atmosphere is now cooling, the alarmists have switched to the ocean heat content. They claim that is alarmingly warming. Of course, it's complete nonsense. The raw data from Argo from 2003 to the present shows a cooling trend. Only after adjustments by the NODC does it show a very slight warming trend, which is 0.003 centigrade per year. I doubt that they can really measure that amount, but that's what they're claiming. But when compared to modelled trend, there's no comparison. Even their adjusted trend is nothing like the model trends. The UK's Met Office EN3 shows, well, quite a good amount of cooling over the Argo series, last 10 years of the Argo series. That's the raw data, but after adjustments by NODC, the data set shows a slight warming.
Even the kind of 2-degree targets that governments have set for climate change, including the Australian government, are much too high.
There's a lot of literature on this. The biggest guy in the field is probably Richard Toll, who has very many papers on the economic effects of climate change. One I'm showing here. This is from the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2009. Basically what Toll is saying is that temperature rises are net beneficial to both the climate and humans up to 2 degrees centigrade. In some cases up to 2.5 degrees centigrade. And there's many other researchers that support Toll in this, so McKibben is completely out of left field here and totally wrong.
we've not even quite raised the temperature a degree so far.
Incredibly, McKibben is making an assertion here, totally unfounded without any scientific evidence behind it whatsoever. Those humans have raised the temperature of the planet almost a degree. It's complete fiction.
And look what we've done. I mean, 80% of the summer sea ice in the Arctic is now missing.
McKibben is now claiming that 80% of the summer sea ice in the Arctic is missing because of us. That's ridiculous nonsense. Here we have Hadkrut 4, which clearly shows that the Arctic was warmer in the 1930s than it is right now. The Arctic temperatures are actually falling dramatically as we speak as well, and in the last 3 years have fallen over 2 degrees centigrade. This 1940 peak in Arctic temperatures is related to the 2001 peak in Arctic temperatures. Solar barycenter cycle. Here we have a paper which has 225 years of Greenland ice melt. Clearly shows that the 1920s and 30s was actually warmer than the present.
And because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, we've loaded the dice for drought and for flood, which y'all in Australia have seen more than your share of in recent years.
McKibben here says warm air holds more water vapor than cold. And yet the data shows that there's less water vapor in the atmosphere. It's been going down. Exactly the opposite of what he claims. So here is the data from NOAA, the Earth System Research Laboratory. It shows that the humidity in the atmosphere has fallen at almost every altitude from 300 to 700 millibars. So what he's saying is the opposite of the facts.
The last decade was the warmest by far on record.
McKibben here claims the last decade was the warmest on record. Well, I suppose it depends what record. The instrumental record, yes, maybe. But let's put a bit of context in this. We'll look at the last 5,000 years. That makes the last decade one of the coolest on record. So this is more misinformation and bullshit from McKibben without any context.
1998 was a very strong El Nino year, and so it set a new record, a record we've now broken twice, though by small margins.
Yes, the old 1998 has been broken twice since then trick. You know, this is GIS nonsense by James Hansen with his adjusted GIS graphs. This is the graph here showing the two peaks, supposedly higher than the 1998 peak. And here are the adjustments, the fraudulent adjustments that have been made by Hansen and his mateys. What the adjustments have done, they've generated a more smoothly increasing global temperature rise since 1880. And the adjustments have only been monitored since May 2008. Dates monitored have been the August temperature anomaly between 1935 and 2006, and that anomaly has been found to have increased from 0.69 centigrade to 0.81 centigrade overall. So this would account for the slight increase above 1998 temperatures noticed by McKibben.
But in general, the pace of climate change continues unabated. Were that it were otherwise, you know, we continue to hope that we're going to catch a break from physics at some point along the way. But so far, all you have to do is, you know, look to the Arctic to get some sense of just how out of control things are.
Well, here McKibben spouts 3 lots of tripe in 10 seconds. The first one, that climate change continues unabated. As we've seen, that's complete nonsense. The second point is that we get a break from physics. We're hoping to get a break from physics. That's more nonsense because none of this is delineated by physics. The physics says that there's no problem that the actual physics of CO2 says that there will be 1.2 centigrade of warming for every doubling of CO2, which is no problem. What it's really saying is that our CO2 is driving the climate, which is complete nonsense. There's no evidence whatsoever for that, and a mountain of evidence against it. For example, for our CO2 to be driving the climate, it means we need to have high feedbacks from water vapor. We don't see that at all. There's no proof that that exists. Quite a lot of evidence to the contrary. This is a graph that shows that high feedbacks, if there was any high feedbacks, that would greatly overpredict past warming. So therefore there's no high feedbacks. And also we've got a paper here by Humlum, Stodel and Solheim, which says that CO2 does not drive the climate, that the climate drives CO2, quite the opposite of what McKibben's claiming. And his third point is the Arctic is out of control. That's even more claptrap. These are the facts here. If we look at the paper by Vinci et al. 2001, it shows that the ice pack in the Arctic is now similar to what it was in 1769. And if we look more recent records, it shows nothing alarming. Ice is similar to what it was in the 1920s and 30s. And the ice is increasing dramatically. 2013 in the Arctic, the ice increased 60% over 2012. Global sea ice is now at a 14-year high. So, McKibben's completely wrong on all his points about the Arctic. There's nothing unusual at all happening in the Arctic.
565 gigatons. That's how much the scientists tell us, that's how much carbon we can release between now and 2050, and have some hope of staying below that 2-degree line. Not a guarantee, but some hope. So 565. Third number, 2,795 gigatons, or 5 times that number. It turns out that's how much the fossil fuel industry has in their reserves. They're determined to burn it. It's what sets their share price. It's what they borrow money against. That coal and oil and gas is still physically below ground, but economically it's already above ground. It will get burned unless we figure out how to stop them.
McKibben is citing numbers here, more complete nonsense. He's assuming that CO2 drives the climate, which we know for a fact it doesn't, and all the data shows that it doesn't. He's saying, he's talking about 500 gigatons of carbon. Okay, in the last 18 years we've put up 500 gigatons of carbon, anthropogenic emissions of CO2. What has been the result? Well, here's Hadcrut 3. That's been the result. Zero temperature rise. That's what 500 gigatons of CO2 does. So what McKibben's talking about is absolute rubbish. Total nonsense, and it's about time this guy really retracted what he's saying.